Good afternoon, and thanks for joining us today for today's webinar, Client and Auditor Expectations and What Really Happens in a SOC 2 Pre-Assessment. I'm David Hammarberg, partner and leader of the firm SOC, Cybersecurity, Forensic Examination, and Information Technology Services with McKonly Asbury, and with me today is Lynnanne Bocchi, manager. For those of you who don't know, McKonly Asbury is an accounting and business advisory services firm with offices in Camp Hill, Lancaster, and Bloomsburg, Pennsylvania. We provide a range of services to organizations across a variety of industries, as you can see on the screen, and we encourage you to visit our website to learn more. If you just joined us on past webinars, welcome back. If you haven't, our monthly webinars features various business topics to keep you updated on what's going on around us. Be sure to check out our website to catch past presentations as well as current information through our blog. If you have any questions for today's presentation, please submit them through the built-in questions function in the webinar control panel, and we will do our best to answer them during or after the webinar. For those of you that are looking to obtain CPE credit for today's webinar, please keep in mind that there will be 3 polling questions throughout today's presentation. You will need to answer all 3 of those questions to get your certificate via email a few weeks after the webinar. All right, let's get started. The formalities are behind us. Jumping into the webinar, just a little bit of an agenda before we start. We're going to go over a basic overview of a SOC 2 audit. Then we're going to jump into pre-assessments. Are you ready? What officially happens in a pre-assessment? Followed by possible expectation misses for a SOC 2 pre-assessment, and then lastly, auditor expectations for a pre-assessment. And I guess lastly would be questions. So looking for a lot of questions, a lot of good questions. We do point out bad questions, so I just want to let you know that. Just kidding. So we are going to jump into our first slide here, SOC 2 purpose. Lynnanne, who gets a SOC 2 examination?
So SOC 2 examinations are for service organizations, and it can be for just about anything. We have clients who provide managed services, many data hosting service providers, insurance medical claims processing, and providers who do software as a service, just to name a few.
Yeah, it does seem like more and more we're getting asked by different kind of clients for SOC 2, and I think it all comes down to what the auditor, who's asking for the report. The clients of the current client that we would have for a SOC 2. So, right. Why do service organizations need a SOC 2 examination?
So, as it says here on the slide, to provide comfort to a user entity organization, and what that entity organization is looking for is to make sure that the processes that they specifically use or obtain services surrounding have adequate controls in place.
Correct. Yeah, and I think as a user entity, and I guess we should really define a user entity, right? So a user entity is someone who is reading this SOC 2 report. So most people on this call probably have heard of a SOC 2, and that is a SOC 2 audit. It's an annual audit, and user entities are the people that are the users of that report. So a user entity could be just a customer, could be an auditor, and we'll get more into that, as you can see at the bottom of the slide here. But again, the user entity is looking to make sure that the service organization's service commitments and system requirements were achieved. And then you have to remember, as a user entity, you are looking for, how would I say it? You're looking for your contract, right? So you might have 12 things in your contract that service organization does, and you're trying to mark those off by saying they get a SOC 2. Now, the service organization is going to be using that SOC 2 for a broad usage, right, of user entities. So maybe 10 of the 12 items that you normally would be concerned with from a SOC 2 standpoint may be in the SOC. So from a user entity standpoint, you may still have to ask more questions. But again, the service organization is looking at the principal commitments and system requirements for a broad range. So that might be 10 user entities and they hit 90% for all of those. So just some definitions and make sure everyone's on the same page.
Great. And before you move on from there, just as Dave indicated, a lot of times your user entity will be a customer, sometimes your major customer or larger customers. And the majority of clients who do get a SOC 2 are doing it because it's required by their customers.
And again, a SOC 2 is a restricted report, right? So you only give it to the users that have the knowledge of a SOC 2 report. If you're giving it to just a general user base, then we'd be looking towards a SOC 3 report. But again, it's a group of people that understand where they're coming from. And used by those who have sufficient knowledge and understanding of the service organization, the service it provides, and the system used to provide those services, which really comes out of the SOC 2 audit guide. So let's move on.
Yep.
Again, SOC 2 is focused on service organizations providing a service to someone. And again, those could be a multitude of different clients. And I think as time has gone by, people have gotten very educated on what a SOC 2 is. And it's one of those things when you get a new vendor, you're asking for that. Everyone's concerned about security and they want to make sure that someone, a third party is looking in after their vendor, et cetera. So SOC 2 service organization must meet the trust services principles defined by the AICPA. And you can see they're listed in the next point. There's security, availability, processing, integrity, confidentiality, and privacy. Ugh. Sorry about that, a little tongue-tied. So there's 5 principles or categories. Lynnanne, what do you see most people doing in the first year? And do you see all those principles being used? Do you see just availability? How does that work?
Right. So security trust principle is required. So that is the first one that every new customer must start with, every new client. Availability, processing, integrity, confidentiality, and privacy usually come in later years. We'll start off with security, and then if you have the controls in place to be able to meet those additional principles, we will add them as the years go on. Another thing that may happen is if you are doing the SOC 2 as a result of a specific contract with a customer, if they are requiring you to have certain principles in place, obviously we will need to cover all of those principles from the start during the pre-assessment.
Yeah, so one key thing from that, and the question I asked Lynnanne is availability only? Well, no, like she said, the common criteria, which the common criteria equals security. So everyone has to have that, and it's a the trust service principles are based around the COSO framework, if you're familiar with that. And again, it's a process. It's not a daunting process, but it's work to get through a SOC 2. A little bit about the SOC 2 report. We have the 5 different sections usually. You could have a 6th section depending on the situation, but auditor's opinions, the first section, management assertion, description of controls, control criteria, and applicable trust services, principles and controls. A little bit about that. The thing that takes the most time in a pre-assessment is gathering the information for number 4, right? The control criteria and what the controls are to meet the criteria. And then the description of controls is a fancy name for what your company does plus all of your controls. And there's a list of, from an auditor standpoint, what we have to have in there, et cetera. But from a layperson standpoint, you're looking at all of the controls and sort of definition of what the client does. Anything to add there, Lynnanne?
No, thank you, Dave.
Lynnanne said, don't ask me any questions unless you let me know ahead of time. So pretty soon I'm going to get slapped, and then she'll have to apologize at the end. All right, here we go. Two types of reports. We've got a type 1 and a type 2. If you're looking at a SOC 2, I know this is about pre-assessments, but this is a little bit extra. You want a SOC 2 type 2. Type 2 is really the design of controls and the operating effectiveness of those controls, and it's over a period of time, not less than 6 months. So that is what you want. That is where you can get comfort in. A type 1 is just the design of controls as of a certain date. So that's fine in certain situations. And what kind of situation would that be, Lynnanne?
I can answer this one. In the circumstance where you are required to get a SOC 2 for a regulatory purpose or for a customer of yours, and they are asking for it by a certain date. For instance, we sometimes have new clients needing a pre-assessment who come to us and say, hey, I just signed this contract with this company and I have to have a SOC 2 type 2 to them by this date. Sometimes we can't always meet that date. And in that case, a lot of times for the first year, the entity is willing to accept a type 1. So they see progress towards reaching the type 2. We will give them a type 1 report saying, yes, all these controls are designed and they're in place. And the next report you're going to see will show us testing the operating effectiveness of them.
Yeah, so it does make sense in some circumstances. If you're reviewing SOC 2s of clients and you get a SOC 2 type 1 year and a type 2 or type 1 the next year, I'd be concerned. That's a red flag in my book. So you should only have a SOC 2 type 1 once, if that. A lot of our clients jump right in from a pre-assessment into the audit period and just do a type 2. But as Lynnanne said, there's some user entities out there that, these user entities are pretty much saying, hey, we're not going to be doing business with you unless you're SOC 2 certified or have a SOC 2 audit done. And in those situations, a lot of times a SOC 2 type 1 will be sufficient. So again, on the bottom there, the responsible party in a SOC 2 is always the management of the company. They're making the decisions. We are helping them get to a point where they can be audited. So always remember that. We have as auditors, we have to be independent. So we're looking towards the management of the company to make those decisions. Doesn't mean we can't help with wording, suggestions, etc. But again, we have to make sure we're independent. And that next point kind of says that in a roundabout way. Service organization determines the applicable trust services principle. They tell us what they want. And again, like Lynnanne said, sometimes that's in a contract. Other times we just suggest, hey, let's attack the common criteria, which by far is the largest criteria or the largest principle of all 5. And one thing to note there, once you get through the common criteria, availability, confidentiality, not a big thing to add. When you get into privacy, process integrity, especially privacy, that's a lot larger pill to swallow. And a lot of people that are new to the SOC 2 environment are like, well, privacy and confidentiality sound pretty close together. What's your thoughts on that? Differences of that, Lynnanne?
So confidentiality would be anything that your organization deems as sensitive information. Privacy much more relates to personal information. So PII, PHI, that type of data.
Exactly. I couldn't have said it better myself. That is exactly where it is. So.
And I think it's good here that you mentioned that the service organization is the owner of determining the principles we use, the controls, and ultimately the narrative. So you need to know there's going to be work involved, a lot of work for your organization to do the pre-assessment. M&A will not just come in and say, yep, here we looked at your organization, here's your controls, here's your narrative. We'll help you with those, but the work needs to be done by the organization.
So just a summary of that section. We wanted to give you a brief overview of a SOC 2, what that looks like, the principles, the types of SOC 2, who's responsible, et cetera. So hopefully we've accomplished that. And now we want to jump more into the first polling question, but then followed by more pre-assessment information. So for our first polling question, does your organization currently have a SOC 2 audit done annually? Answers are yes, no, we are not a service organization. No, none of our clients have asked for one yet. No, although we are being asked for it from clients. So as everyone on this call knows, we need to do these polls for CPE. So sometimes we just have to figure out what to ask. So now I have to stall for about 30 seconds. So no, this is, it's funny because majority of clients who get SOC 2s are asked for them.
Right.
But we do have some clients that just want to do better. They want to be able to make sure that a third party reviews their controls and to see where the gaps are. So it's a great time to do that. So it's you don't have to wait, is what I'm saying, to someone ask for it, but most people do. So we have the results here. Does your organization currently have a SOC 2 audit done annually? And 24% do. 54% say no. So I expect that 54% to be on the call and looking what to expect from a SOC 2. So I think even though you're probably not looking to do a pre-assessment, there's definitely some things you can take out of this presentation. So move to the next slide here. Pre-assessments, are you ready? What officially happens? So prior to the pre-assessment beginning, usually, a pre-assessment will be our first step after that initial call, the proposal, the engagement letter, and just that interaction. Then we have a kickoff meeting, and that kickoff meeting really is to address what we're going over, right? A lot of times the trust service principles have already been defined, what we're using, whether that's security, availability, or confidentiality. And one thing to add here for the people that are looking for a pre-assessment, most of the time a pre-assessment will be an hourly rate, just because you just don't know. We have organizations that are a couple hundred people to 3 or 4 people. And so the controls are going to be completely different depending on the size of the organization, the maturity of the organization. There's so many different factors. So once you're done with that pre-assessment, then you get a fixed fee because we know what the controls are. We know a lot more about the organization. That being said, we jump into this kickoff call knowing what the trust services principles are. And again, the common criteria security usually is the one we're dealing with. And one of the big questions is, when do you need this by? Because most people, like I said, are being asked by someone for it. Yes. And that really dictates how quickly we have to move this ship into port, right? So the question I have for you, Lynnanne, and she's looking at me weird because she has nothing written on her paper, is what do you see as the duration or how quickly a client can move from a pre-assessment into a SOC 2?
So that's a pretty wide range. We probably 6 months ago would have quoted 6 months to a year to do a pre-assessment, but we have had probably 3 clients who have completed one in 3 months or less lately. So it really depends on the resources that you want to allocate to working on the pre-assessment, and we will keep up as fast or as slow as you want to go.
Good answer, Lynnanne. Yeah, I think it really depends on the client. A lot of people now are, I think as we go on here, are putting full-time resources into the pre-assessment, and that really shows. So they keep us on our toes. 3 months is fairly quick. And and probably closer to 2.5 months we've done with clients. And it may be a little bit more painful, but the client then gets to start that period so much faster. So we've had a lot of clients this year start 1/1, and their period is starting either 3/1 or 4/1. The thing with a SOC 2 Type 2 is, again, we have to test these controls over a period of time to make sure that they are designed correctly and operating effectively. So during that period, we need at least 6 months. It could be special circumstances, but we normally need at least 6 months. So if the client of that user entity wants a SOC 2 before they're going to do work with you, well, then you want that as fast as possible. So again, if you're looking for a SOC 2 Type 2, you're probably looking at a minimum of 8.5 to 9 months before you can get that SOC 2 report.
Yep.
And then once that period is over, you're looking at probably 2 to 3 weeks to get that report. So just
That's being generous.
Yes, that's if there's sort of a rush. But again, just for your sake, you probably shouldn't wait to the last minute to get the SOC 2 started. Again, when you need that audit completed by really is dependent on when the user entity needs it. If the auditors of that, someone's asking about it in January, you probably want to end in November or December. And again, those periods don't matter. Like, for a financial audit, it's your year end. But that 6 months could be, January to June this year. And then next year we do a whole year from July 1st to June. We can switch those periods. And a lot of times we see that in pre-assessments where you'll do 3 months and then it's sort of an awkward month to start in, and we'll go from there to the end of the year. And then the next year we change the period from January 1st to December. So that period time is kind of fluent. And we've seen that. So just an FYI, and it's not something that is strange. So if you're looking, for the 54% that are probably reviewing SOC 2 reports, it's not weird to see different periods. There's probably a reason. Right. Define the SOC 2 scope. Again, this is the boundaries of the SOC 2, and most organizations will put their SOC 2 around a certain area, a certain service, whether that's managed services. It's not over the whole organization usually. Now, possibly could be, but a lot of, we do for some clients that have multiple SOC 2s around different service organizations. The reason why you want to have one SOC 2 over 2 service areas is there's different user entities. And there's going to be a lot of confusion between 2 reports. Say you have managed services and you do application development, right? Those are 2 distinct areas. Now, 80% of those controls could be the same for 2 of those reports, but the 20% of controls that are different are going to be very confusing for the user entity reading that. So it's best to break that into 2 reports and give the SOC 2 report to the user entities using the managed services and the user entity using the application development. We've seen that. But again, some organizations have the same controls across different service lines, and it works for one SOC 2 report. But again, we have to decide, or with management, the responsible party, figure out what that scope is of the engagement and make sure we stick with it. One of the things that we often have issues with is the common criteria has a lot to do with security. So you have IT that covers all of the services, and then you have certain things that only cover the service. So people get very confused that, oh, well, this part covers everything, and this part covers a little bit. So as auditors, we try to help the client to stir them and make sure that the boundaries of the system that we are making controls for are correct. And that's a big thing. So if you're using us as a service auditor or you're using someone else, make sure that those boundaries are discussed. In our pre-assessments, we usually meet weekly. We leave it up to the client how often they want to meet, but weekly is great if you're doing 3 months because we gotta stick with it. So in those meetings, you've got to make sure that you're in the boundaries. The third point here probably is the most well, third and the one bullet point on the next page is probably the most time consuming of the pre-assessment. You're going to be mapping current controls, because everyone has controls. Maybe I shouldn't say that. I haven't met the person that doesn't have controls yet. They probably can drop off the call now. No, just joking. Most people have controls. So we're going to map those current controls to the criteria in that common criteria. There's 9 different sections in that common criteria, and there's a lot of areas. And we can map those current controls to multiple areas within that common criteria. We'll take time to do that. It's a really good exercise, and I think it's enlightening for some clients because they see how, some people just gravitate towards fixing one thing, and they'll have a lot of controls in that area, and maybe too many controls, and they can see where their gaps are. So it's the same thing on the security side. If you're trying to secure your network without a framework, you're guessing, right? You're guessing at where your holes are. If you have a framework, you understand where those holes are, and it's the same process here. So again, it's great that a user entity is asking for it, and it's great you're doing the SOC 2, but maybe you should be doing a SOC 2 just because you want to be more secure. I do think that the cost of a SOC 2, you really get what you pay for, and you become more secure.
And we're not just saying that. We're not just saying that.
Yes, we're not just saying that. So, we're all about being secure, and most of our clients get it. If you work with us, we try to do everything through portals, and sometimes it's more difficult. It's more difficult to do business. But again, our client data is the most important thing we own. Besides probably employees, client data is very important. So we're going to do everything we can, and we're not going to make exceptions. So the next point here on this page, during this time, gap analysis is performed to determine whether trust services are met and if additional controls are needed. So we will then look, once the gap analysis is done, we map the current controls, what controls are needed. And we found in a lot of successful companies, there's a lot of controls that are being done, but they're not documented. And I think in most IT departments, you find the same thing. So the thing with a SOC 2 is we need to find evidence that it is being completed. So this audit, you're going to have exceptions if you can't prove that you did that control. So a lot of times it's just documenting and figuring out, do we need a checklist in place? Through your ticketing system, are you going to say you're doing it? Do you have dates on your policies? Do you have revisions? So it's really refining for a lot of mature organizations what you're doing. I was going to say it's really just a fun time, but it may be just fun for me and Lynnanne. But it's a fun time. We enjoy our clients and usually do very well with interaction and do a lot of eating barbecue. But that's a whole nother presentation. But if you want to go out for barbecue, just look me up. Anyway, the last thing there, the auditor works alongside the client to help direct the client to define controls. So pretty much what we've talked about. Yep. Anything, Dan?
All I was going to say was, so you will have a team of us who work with you on the pre-assessment, identifying controls, making sure that you have evidence in place. Once we feel like we are to the point where we've met the trust services criteria, we actually have another review by another partner who is proficient with SOC, who goes through and lets us know if he sees anything that we've missed or has suggestions for wording changes or things like that. So we get some extra value from that second review as well.
Right, we don't want to get through the pre-assessment with questions, do we meet the criteria? When the client jumps into that audit period, they know that if the controls have in place, if they're operating, they're going to have no problem getting through the pre-assessment. And again, we have controls in there to meet the criteria. If one of those controls doesn't happen, say we take a sample of 15 and say they're background checks, right? We do background checks on all employees, yada, yada, yada. And we do 15 and one of them is an exception, what happens then, Lynnanne?
It remains an exception. So this is something that's different from SOCs, if you're familiar with SOCs testing, or possibly with substantive testing during an audit where you pick large samples. We can't just pick an additional sample and say, okay, well, those ones pass, so the control's okay. The control will actually be deficient. It can be remediated during the period, and we can note that, but it will first show up as an exception during the period as well.
So you'll see in section 5 where, the control will be listed, the testing that we did, and in the third column, there'll be an exception, and it'll say exception, 14 out of 15. Does that mean the end of the world? Not necessarily. It means that it's going to be written there. If I was reviewing a SOC 2 for my vendors, the first thing I'm going to look at is exceptions. Do I see any exceptions, right? If you do anything in a SOC 2, look for exceptions. If then the next thing would be to look actually at the controls and see if those controls meet your requirements as a user entity. Do those cover it? But again, an exception doesn't necessarily mean the report's going to be modified, or that the criteria under that control, because a criteria may have 2 to 20 controls under it. It doesn't mean that criteria is going to fail, but there is going to be an exception. Now, if you have 15 out of 15 and there's 3 other controls in that same criteria that have an exception, then we're probably looking at a modified report, which you don't want. But again, we work with the client very closely, and we make sure that they know what they need to know. Communication is huge, right? We think, because we're talking SOC all day long, we think we're very clear. But sometimes, even us, we find that a communication is slipped. So again, weekly communication, and we try to drill in what our expectations are. So during the process, we also, during the process of defining controls, we'll find very clearly who the subservice organizations are. We're not going to dive into the carved out inclusive. That's a whole nother presentation. But subservice organizations really are a vendor. So subservice, I'm trying to think of how I want to put this. 100% of your subservice organizations are vendors, but not 100% of your vendors are subservice organizations. So certain small percentage of your vendors could be so important that your control over that criteria will not work unless you use the control for that vendor. That would make it a subservice organization. Now, whether it's carved out or inclusive is really, another presentation, but that is really what it comes down to. Yes. Anything to add, Lynnanne?
Just maybe to give an example of what Dave was saying, we have a lot of subservice organizations who are cloud providers, with many of our clients going to cloud services, not doing any backups on site, not storing data on site, everything's in the cloud. A subservice provider for them is definitely whoever does their cloud hosting, because that is where their backups and their data is. That's where the privacy around that data or the confidentiality around that data is. So that's just an example.
That's a great example. I think a lot of times we have to rethink the controls for organizations that are really outside the box. And I think we really enjoy doing that, and that's part of the pre-assessment. The next thing there is defining and mapping controls, user considerations, complementary subservice organization controls. Really, what do we expect the client to be doing? So the user or the user entity. So if the user entity requesting this report, what do we expect them to be doing so that our controls work, right? So if we have an application, we're doing a SOC 2 around the application, and the user entity has rights to make users for their users. One of the user control considerations would be maybe MFA or unique passwords, to make sure that the client is doing their part. And it's sort of a thing for the SOC 2 service organization to be like, hey, it's their responsibility. If this thing breaks, it's because the user entity didn't do what they were supposed to do. So when you get a SOC 2 for the 54% again, you want to make sure you look at those and say, hey, am I doing all of those things in that report? Because if I'm not, well, then this SOC 2 report is really saying it really doesn't apply, because those controls possibly aren't working because you're not doing the user entity, the user control considerations. And the same thing with subservice organization controls. Then one of the last things that we do, and I guess I should point out that, again, the biggest part of this and the most time consuming is coming up with controls, mapping controls and coming up with controls. Once we're done with that, man, we're on the home stretch. Then we jump into, could be, again, subservice organizations come in different areas, but then we jump into the narrative. And the narrative, Lynnanne, do you want to just briefly discuss the narrative?
Sure. So the narrative, what it's going to be is a few paragraphs of overview of the company's history, their customer line, that kind of thing. And then basically just a very nicely worded narrative of all of the controls that we have identified. Sometimes some additional information provided around them to make it read clearer, so it's not just like you just listed control after control after control. But generally that's all it is. It can be anywhere from, we've had customers with a narrative that's like 3 or 4 pages long, and then we have some that has a narrative that I swear are 20 pages long. So if you have somebody who was a journalism or an English major and really likes to write, you can get a really nice narrative there in your report.
Yeah, and I think those organizations that really take the time to make a really good narrative or description there, oftentimes are hoping that they're using that as a marketing tool. Now, obviously the SOC 2 is not for that, but it's their time to discuss how they do things and why they do things better. Right? A SOC 2, you can't put in there, we have the best managed services in central Pennsylvania. We're the best data center on the East Coast. It's not a marketing piece. It's not an opinion generated. It's facts. But it can be used to, maybe the control says one thing, and this is a time where you can use the narrative to kind of broaden that and make sure that the user entity really understands what that control is. So it's beneficial to take the time to do that right. And then the very last thing that we do before an audit period can really start is walkthroughs. And walkthroughs are really essentially us making sure that they're designed correctly and they're operating effectively as of that date, right. Really. And just discuss, what we're looking for evidence-wise, how long that usually takes. And again, it's going to take a lot different for the different size companies, whether it's 3 people, 15 people, but an average size, Lynnanne, let's talk average size 40-person firm, let's say managed services. What are we looking through for a walkthrough?
Okay, so how we usually start is we will take the list of controls that we've all agreed upon, and we will create a request list based on those controls. We have a secure portal, which we get a lot of information uploaded to that we can do remotely, but we usually go on site as well if we're able to do some of the physical security controls, as well as meet the client and the different individuals who are responsible for the controls. But what we do when we're there, depending on the type of control it is, we do inquiry for every control. So that's basically, learning exactly how the control functions. And then we will either do some type of examination of whatever documentation they have on hand, whether it's a policy, whether it's actually observing a system in functioning, like observing their ticketing system, observing their firewall, something along those lines. That or observation. And we do observation a lot for physical security controls. In other words, making sure you have security cameras or you have locked server rooms. And also, as I said, if we're going to actually observe how your specific service, if it's of software or something along those lines, functions.
Excellent. Moving on to the next slide, the pre-assessment is complete. So that pretty much covers the pre-assessment. We'll know how many controls you have, and then we'll really have an idea of what the costs are, what that fixed cost is for that audit period. Again, that audit period would be 6 months or more. And at that time, we could do a SOC 2 Type 1 examination. That date would be as of the date of the walkthroughs. And we could give that, again, that has no testing in regards to a period. So it'll list the controls, it'll say that it's designed properly, et cetera. But that's about it. So jumping into the next polling question, how long did your pre-assessment take for your SOC 2? Never had a pre-assessment done? Less than 3 months? 3 to 6 months? Longer than 6 months? I won't tell you how long our longest one was because I'd be a little embarrassed, but it may be still going on. But anyway, that's it's really up to the client how quickly they want to do it, and it really comes down to, most of the time, it's the user entity, right? If you've got a $100,000 client that's like, hey, I'm not doing business with you until you have it done. That's a little bit of stimulation, especially for a small client. Maybe it's $1 million client, but it's it can be done quickly. So we have 84% never had a pre-assessment done, 3 to 6 months, 11%. So that's about where we find when we do pre-assessments. 3 to 6 months is a nice time frame. Yep. Not moving too fast, not too slow. So that is right in line. And moving to the next slide, we will have possible expectation misses for a SOC 2 pre-assessment. So possible misses may take longer than expected. And I think, we're down to our last 8 minutes here, so we're going to move fairly quickly and talk fairly quickly. But Elaine, just got the Will Smith smack. Lynnanne told me if I call her Elaine, I was going to get smacked. So that's it. No, Lynnanne is going to say why the period oftentimes takes longer than expected.
So as we already mentioned, it totally depends on the priority that you are putting on it, that the client is putting on it. As Dave said, we may or may not have one that started before I joined this group and is still going on, but that is not the norm. So it just totally depends what the priority is.
Staff with knowledge to complete the engagement are not the individuals initially put on the pre-assessment. I don't know how many times that we start with one group of people or one person, and halfway through we find out, hey, those aren't really the right people that know our controls, and we have to go into a different direction. A lot of times that's costly for the organization because we're starting over. So that's one thing we don't want to happen. And again, moving down the list, the scope of the engagement is hard to focus on, resulting in scope creep. Again, you have our service auditors here that we are trying to guide you down that process and hopefully keep you on track. But that is one area that we definitely see some misses. And clients do a lot of the right things. We've talked about this before, but they aren't documented. There's no evidence that they're done. We need to work through that, make sure it's documented and that there's proper evidence. And we're moving the next slide. Eventually it'll happen here. Controls need to be put in place to meet the criteria. Let me try again here. Pre-assessment involves various departments, including but not limited to IT, HR, and management. If you try to do a SOC 2 with just IT, you're going to fail, right? You might get CC 6, 7, 8, 9 all done, which are fairly hot, the hardcore IT security areas, but the HR areas, there's going to be misses. So it's a group effort, and all of those departments have to be involved. We try to make sure clients know that ahead of time, but it's important. Yes. It's important, very important. Yep.
And you could take advantage of the fact that all these areas need to be involved to maybe get some things done that you've been looking to get done, but people weren't interested in doing. We have some clients who use the SOC 2 as a stick to get some things taken care of that they've been wanting to get put in place.
Yeah, a lot of times we'll find things that, they should be doing, they know they should be doing, but they just can't get it to, the board of directors or senior management to get pushed to do it. And this is a real good opportunity to get those things that should be done. Everyone knows MFA is sort of stable table stakes at this point in time. But not all organizations are doing it. Not all organizations have an incident response plan. Not all of them review it annually. Those are sort of table stakes nowadays. You should be doing them. Are you using more of an advanced antivirus program that looks for ransomware, et cetera? If you're not, you're sort of behind the eight ball. And then points of focus confusion. We're going to show you here in the next slide briefly what the trust service criteria looks like from the AICPA, which the AICPA is the governing board for the SOC 2. You'll see in the first column CC11, which stands for Common Criteria 1.1, and the criteria is in the second column there, and then points of focus. Now, just real briefly, the controls is where the client, the service organization, should be putting their controls. A lot of confusion lies into these points of focus, which are the same for, majority of these are the same for the COSO framework. So if you look here, the first four are COSO framework. The fifth one is just for the AICPA, but the four there really are, hey, what are the characteristics of the criteria? Maybe memory joggers, where am I going? That doesn't necessarily, you have to meet every one of those points of focus, which clients all, we'd say it till we're blue in the face, but they all want to meet each point of focus, and it's a rough road. We give a library of controls, and a lot of those controls can be used in different organizations, whether that's handbook, et cetera. But again, that is usually a miss. Anything to say on the points of focus?
Yeah, just that you are correct. We don't need to meet every point of focus. We're just trying to meet the criteria itself. And so for an example, for CC 1.1, even though we have 5 points of focus here, we could get away with 3 controls for this section, and they could be that you have an employee handbook with a code of conduct in it that possibly gets acknowledged on an annual basis. You could have an information security policy in place that sets forth expectations as far as security goes, and then that you do background checks on your new hires, and you could be covered with just those 3 controls. Usually our clients have plenty of other ones because CC1 being control environment usually has, it's easier for clients to come up with controls, but just an example that you don't need to cover every point of focus.
Yeah, and the other thing there, I think that sometimes gets confusing in the beginning is people want to use one-to-one relationship, right? It's really, you can use that same control maybe with CC11, CC12, CC5. You can use that control as much as possible. And, we don't want too little controls that if one fails or one has exceptions that, we don't meet the criteria. But on the other hand, we don't want 30 controls for each criteria, right? You're charged by the amount of controls and samples, et cetera. So we want to meet the criteria, and that's what we guide you through during the pre-assessment. Auditor expectations for pre-assessment, and this is our final section. We want to discuss the process so the client fully understands where we're coming from. And I think that's what we've tried to do through this presentation is really communicate. And hopefully the clients don't feel bad if we tell them points of focus 4 times, but it seems like it works out better if we over communicate. And we hope that they over communicate back.
Right.
So I think in day-to-day life, communication can only be improved. Right, we're always looking to improve that. We expect timely replies to requests. The engagement moves on as quickly as possible to the SOC 2 period. That's beneficial for us and them. We're dealing with a lot of pre-assessments, a lot of SOC 2 audits, and the more time between those areas, the more loss of data. more loss of familiarity. And I think when a client continues down that road instead of stopping and starting, there's a lot of benefits from that. So from experience, if you want to do one control and then you take 2 weeks off, it's like starting over. And it's not efficient for anyone. And it really ends up being a SOC 2 nightmare of it's just dragging forever. So anyway, we try to move that along. Again, we move at the client's pace. So if they want to do that, that's fine. But we definitely see a lot more happy clients if they're willing to move with us. We expect a lot of questions from the client. No, you know, I mentioned on this webinar, there were stupid questions, but there are no stupid questions when we were in the pre-assessment. This is a new process and can be difficult for some clients to grasp. Again, we're going to move slowly, so we'll start off with small. Maybe we start off with CC 1.1. Client gets it. They understand what is a control, what we're looking for in a control, what the wording of a control, and maybe you would do a couple CCs after that. But again, we don't want the client to do a ton of stuff wrong and waste time. Every service organization is different, whether it's size, sample, whatever. So we'll work through the challenges that come. We always do, and it's fun looking at them. It's fun understanding the organization. Some of our clients do the most fascinating things, just the fascinating things. They're unique, and if I mention them, you'd probably be able to look up the client. So I'm not going to mention them, but love learning about clients and their food interests, etc. So the next one there, we expect controls will help the client define, will improve the client's internal controls. This process is only going to make you better. And we expect that when we leave, your organization is a safer, more secure, better organization. And that's from year to year. And we expect open dialogue in the process. You don't like how things are going? Let us know. We can always improve.
You don't like working with Dave? Let us know.
Appreciate that. We haven't had those comments yet, but I'm sure they're coming. So for our next polling question, do you review the SOC 2 report from your critical service organization vendors? Yes or no? So everyone should be looking at their SOC 2 reports of their vendors. You should be asking for them. If you're not, again, if I was looking at a SOC 2 report, I want to make sure it's not a modified report. I want to make sure there's no exceptions. I want to look at what my user responsibilities are. And then if I'm really want to do the right thing, I want to read the report. But that is I guess something you have to decide. But again, make sure you get them. So we'll see here where we end up with. So yes, 65%. That is fantastic. If you're not asking for a SOC 2 report, it's real easy to do. Send them an email, ask for the SOC 2 report, and they should be able to send it to you. Yeah. So Lynnanne said if they don't have a SOC 2 report, you can refer them to us. But that was under her breath. So we are going to move into our Q&A side of the question, or the part of the program here. And we do have a question. Are you aware if any cyber insurance company or lending institutions require a SOC 2 audit? Yes, the question here is required is really the important word here. It's only required if your user entity is requiring it. So if you're a cyber insurance company or a lending institution that doesn't have any user entities, customers that care about a SOC 2, you could get away with doing it. There's no government compliance that says you have to have a SOC 2. This is really coming from your user entity. I require you to have a SOC 2 so I do business with you. So we do see both of those having SOC 2s, but again, there's data centers out there now with no SOC 2. And why? You know, you would think that every data center in the world would have, not the world, it's a United States thing. So every United States data center would have a SOC 2, but you'll find some that don't. So it's really up to the user entity. And if I was looking into going with a cyber insurance company or a lending institution, I would definitely ask for a SOC 2. And if I was looking side by side for two of those, a SOC 2 would give me a lot more comfort than someone who doesn't have a SOC 2.
So I want to answer that question differently because I did not interpret it the same way you did. So this way, regardless of how the question was asked, we should have it covered. I read that question as if I was trying to get cyber insurance or get a loan, would the cyber insurance company require me to have a SOC 2? Or would the lending institution require me to have a SOC 2? And I think that they could. For cyber insurance, they definitely expect you to have certain security controls in place. I don't know if they necessarily require you to have a complete SOC 2. And the lending institution, obviously, that would be at their discretion, depending on what they wanted.
I've seen a lot of cyber insurance, and you're probably wrong, Lynnanne, but no, just joking. I've seen a lot of cyber insurance applications, and they do ask if you have a framework, and a lot of times SOC 2 is there to check. So it can only help you if the question is when you're going for cyber insurance, will it help? So I would say yes. Those kind of, and especially a lending institution, they're looking to make sure that you're secure, and that's one way you can prove to it. If you don't have a SOC 2, are they still going to give you cyber insurance because you have a NIST framework instead of a SOC 2? They are. But when you have a client or user entity that asks for a SOC 2 and you say, I have a NIST framework, they're not going to care. They're going to want the SOC 2. So I think it's different, but I can definitely see how that's worded. So it's 2:57. That rounds up our questions. I think this was a fun presentation for me, hopefully for you as well, Lynnanne.
Definitely. I was waiting to see where you were going with that. I thought you were going to say, I think this is a really helpful conversation, you know, if we do say so ourselves.
Well, it was both helpful and fun, and we look forward to the next presentation. So I am going to do my responsibilities and get to the closing slide. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar. If you have any further questions regarding today's presentation, please feel free to reach out to one of us and we'd be happy to assist. A recording of today's presentation will be posted on our website and social media sites in a few days. And for those of you who have requested CPE and answered the polling questions, those certificates will be sent out within the next 2 weeks. Thanks again for joining us and enjoy the rest of your day.